Thank you.
Thank you, Sinamar. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. So I will be doing the majority of the speaking. Mauricio is here to answer any of your questions about how the modeling was done for this, because he was the statistician that I brought on board. And I'm very excited to share some of the results of the work I've been working on. So let's get started. So up on the upper left-hand side of the screen, these are the 5 locations that the study I'm going to be talking about today is taking place in. The study was conducted in the western area of Honduras, in the Feed the Future zone of interest, which is the USAID area where they focus on agriculture and rural livelihoods in development aid. On the right-hand side, in terms of food insecurity, you can see the same 5 locations. 2 of our study sites were in an area of high food insecurity, and 2 were outside of an area of high food insecurity. However, our results are going to end up showing that the food security levels are very high throughout our study sites. So this 2015 map is fairly old in terms of where food insecurity is really hitting. Our study sites are also, Honduras is experiencing rather severe effects of climate change, especially in terms of droughts, temperature, and lack of rainfall. So on the left hand, on the bottom there, we see the drought index from 1950 to 2000. And then on the right hand side is a prediction for how high the drought levels are going to be in 2070. So we see that the area of Honduras that we're working in is very dependent upon agricultural productivity, agricultural production. However, they are facing some rather dire climate change impacts. Over on the left-hand side, I included this study because one of the more interesting and strange results out of our study is that we're finding that narco-traffickers and gangs are buying up land in rural Honduras. And so we're still unsure of why exactly that's happening, except for some data that has been put out in relationship to narcotics-related deforestation, and both using the land to produce narcotics, but we also think that in this western area of Honduras, some of what we're seeing is gangs and narco-traffickers buying land from rural persons who are losing their livelihoods due to the impact of climate change, and they are scooping up that land to use that land as a way to pass over into Guatemala and El Salvador as part of the drug trade. So on the upper right-hand side, you can see that this is the area of Honduras where there are known drug trafficking routes on the western side of Honduras, right on the border of Guatemala and El Salvador. So we chose some study sites in there to also kind of get some of the border effects of what might be going on, as well as areas that have higher levels of violence in Honduras as compared to lower areas. And on the bottom right-hand side, we see the same thing, but in terms of migration. So the pushed migration is out of the large urban areas. However, there is a large amount of migration happening out of the rural areas, especially in the past few years. And so we really wanted to take a look and understand what's going on that is driving that migration as one of the purposes of this study. So just a little bit of background before we go into it. So Honduras has a very high intentional homicide rate, the second highest in the world behind El Salvador. And that's important because in countries where there is a lot of impunity for crime, it's very rare for a homicide to not go reported. And so we can use homicide as a proxy for kind of the overall levels of violence within a country. And so we see that Honduras, it has one of the highest levels of intentional homicide rates in the world. And it has for a very long time has been in the top 5 since data started being collected by World Bank in 1999. Ever since that time, Honduras has been in the top 5 countries for intentional homicides. As you may know, in 2009, there was a coup, which some people call a diplomatic overthrow, very destabilizing in the country. The immigration crisis is ongoing, but we see a very high level of the migrants, undocumented migrants, crossing over into the U.S. border or attempting to, being from the Central American countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Not exclusively, but a large number is coming from that area. So the question, of course, is why. And then we also had a quite disruptive election in 2017. It was highly contested. The political stability is not good in Honduras, as well as a high level of corruption. And because of that, we have the very high level of impunity for crimes, a lot of skepticism and distrust in the Honduran government. There's a high level of gang and narco trafficking activity. Some people would call Honduras a narco state. It's a very controversial way of describing Honduras. However, there is a high level of presence, and we found in our study that there's a much higher level of gang and narco trafficking presence in the rural areas than we had previously realized. And on top of that, we're also seeing this vilification of young men. Young men are having a very hard time finding jobs. There's a general distrust of them. And we're seeing this issue of perverse institutions. And so this is the idea of institutions that are supposed to serve a public good, such as the education system or the police system, but instead are serving to reinforce the societal issues that are already at play. And so, for example, young boys and men don't feel welcome in the education system. And so we see higher levels of dropout, especially between the primary and secondary level among boys, who are less likely to go into secondary education. And then, of course, there's also a lot of distrust of the police and the police system, which is also contributing to this general feeling of a lack of stability in the country generally. So this study, supported by USAID Honduras, was really intended to look at how livelihoods are changing in the rural areas of Honduras, what people perceive of as their opportunity pathways, what are the actual options that people see for their lives, and what contributes to the decision of somebody to take one route versus another route in terms of what livelihood opportunities exist. And it also was looking at how this is tied to violence in the country, whether that be interpersonal violence, youth violence, gender-based violence, and so on. And finally, how all of these things are working in tandem to determine whether or not somebody chooses migration as the most viable livelihood opportunity. So today I'm going to really focus in on the migration results of the study, although those other pieces all interplay in terms of what is driving the migration, especially out of the rural areas. So the theoretical framework for the study was based out on a theory called social disorganization. It's usually applied in urban areas, especially in more developed countries, to explain why people who have lived in a location for a long period of time, even when the population itself has changed over time, why those geographic sites are still high sites of crime and delinquency. And so we applied this in the rural areas of Honduras to see how the economic deprivation is connected to the disruption of the family in terms of having people migrated, interpersonal violence, having family members who have died, divorce, and so on. Community disruption, so in terms of trust of leaders, participation in the community, distrust of people coming in and out, the sense of community security, and so on. How that is also connected to a lack of institutions or weak institutions, and that is inclusive of, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the police and the education system, also inclusive of aid organizations, such as USAID projects or NGOs, faith-based organizations, and so on. And then how these all end up in this state of conflicting moral values, where a value where normally you wouldn't act, you wouldn't commit violence, you wouldn't participate in delinquency, you wouldn't make a certain type of decision. But when all of these other things result in illicit opportunity, delinquency being the best option. And so at that point in time, your moral values come in conflict with the opportunities that exist for you. So we're looking at that as the basis of this overall study. And then within that, we also included looking at how climate change, food insecurity, and then the overall pervasive sense of violence and fear in Honduras are interacting. So for this study, this is a large mixed method study. We did 667 household surveys. Those were the door-to-door, almost 4,300 school-based surveys. That was over 5 municipalities and 12 communities. And the qualitative methods included 98 reciprocal peer interviews. That's a methodology when you train an individual to interview a colleague or friend, and then they interview the other person in turn. So it's a dyad situation. They're provided with training. It takes the researcher out of the equation, and which was how we were able to ask young people between the ages of around 13 to 27 of their perceptions of what is driving migration and violence in Honduras. We conducted 13 focus groups and then key informant interviews with 42 organizations and other key informants. All of the surveys went through a validation process in terms of adapting existing surveys, pilot testing it, using a focus group of Hondurans for the proper language, as well as statistical validation and revision, and those went into the 2 household and school final surveys. We covered a lot of variables in these different categories of variables, 33 in the school survey and 82 in the household survey, looking across a suite of variables to try to understand the systems level, how agriculture, economics, perception of community and opportunity, and security drive migration. In terms of analysis, we conducted quite a few hypothesis testing using tests of association. My colleague Mauricio did the data modeling for predicting migration. And then the qualitative data were analyzed using a thematic analysis and a cross-case analysis. So, overview of the results. So what we're seeing here in the western rural area of Honduras, we see a fair 25% of total households report having had somebody from their household migrate within the past year, and that would have been in 2019. Out of that 25%, most of the households report that one person has left their household, but then we also see cases where it has been 2, 3, or even entire families who have left the rural areas. And this includes both urban to rural to urban migration and transnational migration. So it's a little hard to tease out where people have migrated to, and because there's a lot of reluctance in terms of sharing that information. So this is basically covering why people are leaving the rural areas of Honduras. But when we asked the general question of where people are migrating to, the vast majority, going on 80%, said to the United States. Okay, in the school survey, we see a similar number of around 30% who report that they have had a family member migrate in the past year. You can see from both surveys, Marcala is the community that is the municipality with the lowest level of migration. And we think that this has a lot to do with the coffee production in that region, providing some protective factor in terms of the economic drivers of migration. However, even in Marcala, there has been impacts of climate change and quite a bit of reporting of crop losses. In terms of motivation for migration, when we ask people why do you feel that people have left your community, by and large, they say that jobs, poverty, and the working conditions are the driver of migration. So on the left side, you see that 47% of the households say that it is motivated by economic drivers, and 93% of the students say it's driven by economics. And when we take a closer look at that, what we end up seeing is that when we ask if there are job opportunities available on farm, and that can be, daily labor, it can be selling crops, it can be value addition to crops, and so on. About half of the households in the household survey say that there are low or no opportunities on farm. And then off farm, in terms of if you want to be a teacher or a police officer, a security guard, any other off farm job, 73% say they just simply don't exist in the rural areas. And this is inclusive of the Casco Urbano, or the major city center that is located in the municipality. And so here we see almost 97% when you look at low or no out of the household survey, that they just say that the jobs just aren't there. On the right-hand side, in the school survey, we see similarly high numbers. 30% of the students say that there are no jobs. 45% say that there's a moderate level. So they have a little bit more hope on the student side. And in terms of off-farm opportunities, they are still saying half of the students say that the jobs don't exist. But then when we look at education as one of the protective, yeah?
There's sound come from your video. I think it seems like a paper or something. That
I don't think it's me.
I think I looked and everyone is muted. Just
Audrey, are you hearing something wrong with my sound?
Maybe it's your mic, Becky. Your mic and your shirt.
Does it help if I move my computer like this?
Yeah, maybe your mic is like rubbing against your clothes or something like that.
Yeah, I would try to sit more still and be less excited. How's that?
I think it's good.
Okay, well, I'll try not to move too much. Okay, so in terms of education, which we typically see as a protective factor against migration, what we see here is that on the left-hand side, the 47% of households are saying that jobs are not available. Well, when we ask people if they feel like education leads to job acquisition, 90% of those say no after primary school, which obviously that makes a lot of sense. 72% say no after Plan Básico, which is basically our equivalent of middle school. And 64% say no, there are no jobs, even if you finish high school. And that's quite alarming, because as you see, as we go on to the right side of the screen there, insufficient education declines in terms of the perception that that there is insufficient education to get a job, declines as you get higher level of education. Again, that makes sense. However, the perception that there are no jobs available also increases as you achieve greater education, to the point where 56% say after Plan Diversificado, which is the high school level, that there's just simply no jobs available. And 25% of those same people say that even in there are jobs, you have to know somebody to get that job. Okay, in terms of migration of the family, or excuse me, in terms of the gang and narco trafficking influence on migration, one of the questions we really wanted to answer is whether or not the gang and narco trafficking presence and the high levels of general violence in Honduras are driving migration. Well, in the perception of the participants, that as a specific driver is actually fairly low. Only 6% of households say that gangs and narcos are a driver of violence or driver of migration, but 21% of the students say so. And when we look at their perception of gang and narco traffickers, we see that 25% of households and 30% of students report that they believe there has been gang or narco trafficking activity in or near their community in the past several months. And we also see that they have a relatively high perception of the availability of illicit livelihoods, meaning that you can go and work for a gang or a narco trafficker as a livelihood option. So in terms of agriculture and climate change, again, it looks like only 7% of the participants say that this is the driver of migration. However, when you take a step back and look at the other data, 68% of our study participants report major crop losses, and that's up to almost 80% in one of our municipalities. So there is an issue of crop decreases, and as well as the drivers that they attribute that to are droughts, an increase in pests and diseases, and severe storms. So all three related to climate change impacts. We asked a question as to whether or not the participants themselves feel like climate change is driving migration. And in terms of the words climate change, they say 36% say, yeah, this is a serious problem. But when you phrase it as crop failure, it jumps to 63% of the participants that say that it is a major driver of migration out of their communities. And then when you dig into that, what we're finding is that it's a combination of low crop yields or crop losses, low prices for crops, poor crop quality, and we're seeing more of that, for example, in the coffee sector, as we're starting to see the influence of certain pests and the coffee rust, as well as corn and beans, where the price is just simply of the worldwide market is just low right now. And then that is leading to an inability of people to be able to pay back their bank loans. So one of the drivers is in terms of this economic factor is actually bank loans that are related to agricultural production and the declining productivity. When we asked it qualitatively in our reciprocal peer interviews, which total we had 67 female and 53 males in terms of usable surveys or usable interviews. Again, the vast majority are pointing to the job and the economy. We have a general feeling of distrust and frustration with the government in Honduras. And then it goes down to the idea of a better life, and agriculture and climate change and violence come pretty low on the list in terms of the qualitative. And so when you ask them, when you look at what they're saying, you know, they basically say that, yeah, migration has helped because they have found work. And when they work, they send money to help us with school. And we did find that students who are the recipients of remesas or remittances are much more likely to be attending school than those who don't. And then they also say, on the one hand, they go to another country. You're happy because they made a sacrifice and can help the family to be more stable, but it also influences you a lot because you miss them so much. And then finally, in part, it helps you to get necessities, but also you aren't like a family anymore. And so a lot of these emotional aspects of people migrating have had significant, I shouldn't say significant, it's qualitative, but they have had effects on how people are perceiving of the impacts of migration. So in terms of intent to migrate, in the household survey, about 24% of our participants intend to migrate in the next year. And that's statistically higher among men, which does, again, it makes sense. And the vast majority say that they intend to migrate to the United States. However, there is a difference there in terms of men and women. In our results, men are more likely to want to go to the United States. Women are more likely to want to go to Spain specifically. And when we ask why that is, it's because of the types of jobs that are available. So in the United States, the migrants are looking towards jobs in restaurants, construction, and agriculture. And in Spain, it tends to be more childcare and housekeeping. So it falls more within the female domain. In the school survey, again, we see quite a few students who say that they're want to migrate in the next year. What's interesting to me here is how that number increases as the youth get older, to the point where when they're 19 years old, 70% of our population said that they wanted to migrate or they intended to migrate within the next year. So the 16 and up population, you see quite a bit of distress as they finish their education and look and see that there aren't jobs available. In terms of prediction of migration, so this is where the modeling came in, and where Mauricio gave me just an absolute wonderful set of results. We find that what predicts migration is a combination of the amount of land owned, whether or not a household has had decreases in crops, and especially in corn and beans. So the corn and beans are the canasta básica, the major food sources in the country. The perception of whether or not a community is supportive of youth, and this variable encapsulates whether or not youth are involved in decision making, whether or not they feel like they have a role in the community, if they are involved in the community and community decisions and planning. And so when there's a low perception of community supportive youth, there tends to be a high intent to migrate. Similarly, when there are poor on-farm opportunities, when people perceive that there aren't jobs on farm, it increases the likeliness they're going to migrate. And the same with illicit opportunities. When they perceive that there is a higher level of jobs with gangs and narco-traffickers, they also have a higher intention to migrate. Community security, in terms of whether or not you feel like your community is safe, and whether or not you have been a victim of physical violence. So when we look within these results, these were the modeling results, but we also did some hypothesis testing in terms of what we thought were going to be the related factors. And some of the more interesting things that we find when looking at within the variables is that larger holdings, people who have a higher amount of land, tend to sell crops and have a higher income. But along with that, people who have a positive view of on-farm livelihoods also tend to have more land, sell crops, and have a higher income. So what's happening is that people who are dependent on subsistence agriculture or who are smallholders have a much more negative view of farming as a viable livelihood strategy. When we come over to community support, we see that a high level of community support negates the small land holding as a driver of migration. So if I don't have a lot of land, but I feel like my community is supportive, then I'm less likely to migrate. And it is also lower, your view of community supportive youth is lower if you've been a victim of violence. It is lower if you also believe there are a lot of illicit opportunities. So it seems like if I feel like there's more jobs with gangs and narco traffickers, I have less perception of my community being supportive. And it's also higher when you are a leader in the community or if you actively participate in the community in terms of attending community meetings and participating in different community groups. The community security is a trigger for migration when there is low levels of community support. So if you feel like your community is very supportive, even if you feel like the security isn't great and you don't have a lot of land, you're still less likely to migrate because that community support seems to be a really important protective factor against migration. We also see that low on-farm opportunities and high corn and bean losses. That is when community security becomes a trigger point. And then finally, you tend to have a lower perception of community security if you've been the victim of violence or if you have perpetuated violence. So even those who have participated in violence have a lower view of their community security. And it's also lower when there's a high level of distrust in the police and in the local government. And finally, under illicit opportunities, there's a higher perception of illicit opportunities when there's also high food insecurity. So it seems like there's also a connection between people who are aware of and looking at illicit livelihoods as a livelihood opportunity when they also are very food insecure. And that was particularly true for severe food insecurity. So there's a much higher likeliness that you perceive there's a lot of opportunities with gangs and narco traffickers if you are severely food insecure. And this is probably obvious, but a higher perception of illicit opportunities is also connected to whether or not you have an acceptance of interpersonal violence. In terms of the school, so that was for the household survey. In terms of the school survey, it's very similar with some slight differences. For example, age becomes an important variable here, where the younger kids are less likely to migrate than the older kids, as we saw in the graph. Again, on-farm livelihoods rises to the top. If there's a low perception of on-farm livelihoods, there's a higher likeliness of migration. Again, illicit livelihoods, when there's a high perception of illicit livelihoods, there's a higher likeliness of migration. Community supportive youth, again, comes to the top, as does food insecurity, although the food insecurity had a low effect overall, but it still was one of the drivers. And whether or not a family member has already migrated. So that was particularly important for the youth, more so than the households. So again, when we take a step back and look within the variables, high food insecurity also is connected to high perception of illicit livelihoods and a lower perception of community support and of family support. So when you're hungry and you have high food insecurity, you find your community and your household to be less supportive. In terms of illicit livelihoods, a low perception of the availability of illicit livelihoods results in a high migration intent when community support is low. So again, community support as a protective factor against migration is very important in our overall results. And finally, if a family member has migrated in the last year, that increases migration intent for the younger kids, which I think is actually connected for kids' desire to reunify their families. But it's, the reunification of families didn't rise to the top in the statistics or in the qualitative measures in terms of being a major driver of migration. On the flip side, though, remittances are a protective factor. So families who are receiving remittances from abroad tend to have lower food insecurity and a higher perception of the availability of on-farm livelihoods. So what predicts migration from the school? This is a really cool classification tree that Mal put together in terms of our study results. So of school participants who intend to migrate, if you have a low perception of illicit livelihoods and you're younger than 14, that's over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you're less likely to migrate. If you're older than 14 and a half years old and you have at least a moderate perception of community supportive youth, then you're less likely to migrate. But if you have a poor perception of community supportive youth, then you're more likely to migrate. So again, over here on the right-hand side, those who have at least a low perception of the availability of illicit livelihoods and who are younger than 13 years old, but who have not had a family member migrate, are less likely to intend to migrate. So that's the issue with the young kids is really tied to this idea of their family members having left. On the right-hand side, if you have a low perception of the availability of illicit livelihoods and you're older than 13 and a half, then you're more likely to migrate. I see some chat stuff. Oh, yeah. I'll come back to your questions. I just saw a couple, and I'll come back to those in a minute. Okay. Okay, I apologize for the background noise. Somebody is doing construction. In terms of the reciprocal peer interviews, the drivers of migration from their perspective, they have a very negative view overall of migration as a livelihood strategy. And that's largely because of the physical danger. They're very aware that that trip from Honduras to the United States is extremely dangerous, and there's a high likeliness of injury or death. It's not a secret. The emotional cost is something that the young people bring up consistently as a major issue. This is also where separation of the family and the emotional cost of that comes into play. And that results also in a lack of parents and a lack of guidance for young people. There are some that have a conflicting view of migration with the positive and negative attributes. And that tends to be young people who say it's helpful because they send money home, but our family is no longer a family. And then there's a few that had a positive view of the results of migration, and that almost was exclusively in terms of the economic benefit. So I think this is a very important quote here. In my community, there have been a lot of people who have gone because there isn't enough work. The lack of work is affecting us in a big way because sometimes we sit and think about how we are going to move our family forward. And it's frustrating that the best option is to migrate to other countries, to find the American dream. But the truth is that, yeah, we don't know if they're going to return. And there are many cases when people return dead. Nobody knows if one day they will come back or if they will leave our homes and simply never return. So I thought that was a really important quote because that really captures kind of the overall issues that we're seeing in terms of the economic drivers and the ties to migration, even though it's dangerous, can be a better option than trying to maintain on-farm livelihoods. And finally, in terms of mitigation, we asked young people their views on mitigating, and they were kind of at a loss, as you can see by the number of responses that we got. However, they point again to the need for more economic opportunities. There was a lot of attention on parenting skills, and this has a lot also to do with the other part of our study, which was looking at drivers of violence, why people participate in illicit livelihoods and violent activity and delinquency. The parenting skills is also very much tied to that. And that, for example, one of the youth said to us, the fathers never talk to their sons. And so, this is one issue that the young people really feel pretty strongly. And it's also very evident in our violence work that parenting is a site of intervention for both migration and violence. And then also education came up, even though young people feel more and more increasingly as they go through their education and approach graduating high school, they have less faith that that is going to result in a job, to the point which many of the boys that we speak to say that it's no longer worthwhile going to school. And so they say it's basically better to go get paid a daily wage so I can eat right now than it is to go to school, not be able to work while I'm in school, and then not be able to get a job when I'm done. And so this is another interesting quote. People who have money must use their hearts and think of other countries who have troubles they cannot overcome, or that they do not have a good president who makes good decisions. Well, there should be more educational centers, more careers, because the careers that there are, some do not like. And they're largely talking about agriculture here in terms of when we ask them more in depth about this topic. Young people see a lot of value in agriculture in terms of cultural heritage, in terms of feeding their families, and in terms of survival. But very, very few students see agriculture as a livelihood pathway that is going to support their family and pull them out of poverty. It says they have nothing to do with what they think, study, then if there were more careers, we could stay in the community and work. So there needs to be for the 18-year-olds to be employed. So finally, I wanted to show you this. We mapped out the significant relationships between the hypothesis testing and also the modeling as well, and the qualitative data to see how all of these different pieces are interacting with one another to get a more comprehensive view of the social, ecological, and economic ties. And so this is a little bit of a complicated map, but in terms of the recommendations that were given to USAID, we built our recommendations based on how these different relationships are interacting with one another. So migration is right there in the center, and you can see that that there's a lot of different statistical as well as qualitative relationships between these different variables. And so in terms of suggesting interventions, we focused on those on the right-hand side that would hit multiple variables at the same time. And so some of those are things like sustainable agricultural intensification, with the express understanding that smallholders are simply not going to be able to reach that level of intensification without a significant amount of inputs and aid. And one of the most important variables that came out of this was the idea of community cohesion and trust. And so we suggested quite a few interventions in terms of building community trust and bringing young people into community decision making. So I know that was a lot, and I'm happy to talk more about any aspect of the study as well as the potential mitigation strategies. And so I just want to quickly say thank you to USAID Honduras for funding this study, my colleagues at Virginia Tech, who were the primary award recipients, and the University of Florida was a sub-award for that project. And a huge thank you to Mal for his amazing stats work, as well as Nick Diaz, MDP graduates, who was our field director for data collection, and Colleen Abel, who did a really great job for her MDP practicum collecting data for us. So from there, I'm going to pause and scroll up to some of these questions and see